Good to see everyone this morning. Glad you came out in spite of the rain. Glad to have you all visiting with us. Clearly you care nothing of your reputation if you're here with Dennis, but maybe Jenny helps. Jeannie helps. And so thank you all for coming. We certainly want you to feel welcome. We're glad that we have some back who've been away, and so we're glad that you're here, and that maybe that's an indication of you feeling better. Susan, you should never worry about your attire. In a world of Charles Pierce's, nobody's going to pay attention. Charles, try to give you the last word.
Oh, okay. I was hugging Susan, telling her it was okay. We'll contemplate on that and get back to you.
Okay. George, if you're having trouble getting rid of change, even small bills, I've got 3 grandchildren that seem to have an ability to be magnetically attracted to that. I'll go in my billfold will be empty, and I'll say, well, they've been here. So. But we do hope that Jenny's feeling better, and tell her we missed her. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a different slant on something that we all know like the back of our hands from the Bible, and so it'll give you something to think about a little bit. If you go back to early 1990s, can you still remember back that far? I struggle sometimes. The United States was engaged in the first Gulf War. And that was the time of General Stormman Norman Schwarzkopf. We remember him. You know what prompted that. The forces of Iraq under Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait and had just really rampaged their way through that country. And the United States and the Allies began to mount an invasion force. And the Iraqis felt like that the first invasion would come right there on the coastline at Kuwait. And so as soon as the activities of war began to kind of ratchet up, thousands of Iraqi soldiers decided it was time to escape. The escape route was a 6-lane highway called Highway 8 that went all of the way from Kuwait to the Iraqi town of Basra, which we've all heard about. That highway, along with the roads that were kind of built around it, was probably the biggest highway in that whole part of the world. And so if you were going to escape, that was the obvious place to run for it. That's what the Iraqis thought. If you were going to escape, that was the place to run for. That's what the Allies thought. And so they put all of their airplanes with their bombs into that region. They put all of their tanks and artillery with nighttime vision into that region. And on the night that these Iraqi soldiers began to escape, it became like a turkey shoot. And when the morning light dawned, there were over 2,000 Iraqi vehicles of war and mechanisms of war that were along that highway, destroyed and burned out. There were upwards of 100,000 troops that were either captured or that was killed. At one bottleneck that was about a mile long, that has become known as the mile of death on the highway to hell, there were almost 3,000 people that were killed and all of their weapons of war destroyed. Basically, in taking that escape route in such a blatant way, the armies of Saddam Hussein would never have a good day again in battle. But we understand that. We understand the concept of an escape route. It's really interesting if you go back and look at the pictures from that day that there were American soldiers that are pictured doing great acts of mercy, going and helping these Iraqi soldiers who had been their enemy to find some kind of safety, giving them water to drink, giving them food, helping bind up their wounds just like they would of their fellow comrades. And so if you go and look at that horrible moment of war, those American soldiers showed great character in the way that they cared for the enemy. But you know, I think that most people, when they saw the scenes from that moment of battle, and when they knew about the horrific life of Saddam Hussein and his fanatical followers, they probably would have looked on those battle scenes and would have said, they deserved what they got. They deserved it. And I'm sure that it would be very easy to make arguments that would move in that direction, that they deserved it. Now, if you go back into the 1940s early on, you remember back that far? The American troops had landed in the middle of the summer and D-Day, and in about a month they were breaking out of the beachhead and finding their way into the countryside. By the time you've gone 2 months, the Americans had won a great battle at a French town called St. Lo. The British had finally been able to turn the tide at a famous French town, Caen. And so now it was ready for something new to happen. And so General Eisenhower reactivated Patton's Third Army. And he gave the command that the British would move from the north, from Caen, and the Americans would move from the south at St. Lo, and they would catch the great German armies of Western Europe in a pincher at a place called the Falaise Gap. That was the escape route. That was a broad valley that reached from the coast back toward Paris and then into the safety of Germany. And so everyone that knew anything about the way of battle knew that this Falaise Gap would be the escape route. And basically, the Americans and the British, the Polish, who really distinguished themselves in the Battle of the Falaise Gap, caught these fleeing German armies there. 250,000 German soldiers, some of their best, were captured or killed. And there was more armament of the German army, the best that they had, that was captured as well. Many of the German generals knew at that point that the war was over. But there are wonderful pictures. And in the wonderful pictures of the Battle of the Falaise Gap, there are English infantrymen who have captured German soldiers, who have helped them with their wounds, and in the afternoon are serving them tea, and everyone kind of has some smiles on their faces. Soldiers showing, in the heat of battle, a great deal of mercy. Now, there is a British journalist who wrote about that Falaise Gap, and he said that when he walked through there, that it was hard to walk in a straight line because of all the corpses on the ground and all of the death and destruction. And my guess is that if we think about the horrors of Adolf Hitler, if we think about all of the evil that he spawned, if we looked at those battlefield scenes and we looked at those dead enemy soldiers, then we might say they deserved it. Hitler deserved it. They should never have pushed it that far. They deserved what was going on. My father-in-law, who was an American infantryman, right in the middle of every bit of that, would have had a different opinion. His different opinion would have been that those German soldiers were mostly boys, just like the Americans. Those German soldiers were mostly scared to death, just like the Americans. Those Germans wanted nothing more than to get back home to safety, just like the Americans. Because he had been in those dangerous situations, because he had been in moments where he thought he might die or be taken captive, he looked at those enemy in a different way. But if it's you and me, we might quickly say they deserved it. Now, let's narrow our focus a little bit and let's go back about to about 1000 BC. Let's go back to the Bible. It's interesting how things that far back just keep being repeated. Last week we talked about Absalom, David's son. We talked about him being one of the most beautiful people in the world. We talked about how he had these long locks of hair that got caught in a tree that led to his demise. Remember that? But we also talked about how he was going to do this coup d'etat and he was going to overthrow his father. and that it was almost successful. The only thing that saved David was his escape route. And his escape route was the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. About an 18-mile stretch of ground, downhill all the way, that people had been using to escape Jerusalem from almost the dawn of time. And David ended up being very lucky in that regard. He was able to get out ahead of Absalom. He was able to get out of the way of this man whose name literally meant Father of Peace. And he was able to head down that Jericho road and was able to make his way to a point of safety. He found an escape route that worked. But if you move forward in time about 500 years or a little more, the king of Israel then is Zedekiah. And I've always felt sorry for Zedekiah in a way. Zedekiah was not a bad man. He was just a king who was totally and completely in over his head. Everybody kind of liked Zedekiah, but he was totally inept. He had put people around him that knew nothing of governing in any kind of a just and fair way. And then he got caught up in the middle of two competing political parties in Israel, one that were pro-Egyptians, one that were pro-Babylonians. And Zedekiah made the wrong decision. He decided to cast his lots with Egypt. And when he did, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, sent an army of Chaldeans to besiege Zedekiah at Jerusalem. And the city was besieged and everyone was starving to death. The walls were finally ruptured and the Chaldean armies poured in. Zedekiah knew exactly what to do. He headed for his escape route. And he took off on that Jerusalem to Jericho road, 18 miles straight downhill. David, his forebear, has found safety there. Zedekiah didn't. They caught up with him. They captured him. They took him back to Babylon, where he was humiliated and tortured like some terrible animal, and Nebuchadnezzar put him to death. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho becomes one of the most interesting escape routes in all of history. Worked sometimes, it did for David. Didn't work sometimes, didn't for Zedekiah. Now, you may be wondering why I'm talking about this road. And you may be wondering why I'm trying to portray it accurately as an escape route that was only taken under the most desperate circumstances. And the reason is that road from Jerusalem to Jericho is the setting for the parable of the Good Samaritan that we know so well. And so Jesus knew a great deal about that road. Charles has probably traveled that road, but it is interesting. Jericho is actually to the northeast of Jerusalem, but you always talk about going up to Jerusalem or going down to Jericho. And the reason is that Jerusalem sits at about 2,200 feet above sea level, and Jericho sits at about 800 feet below sea level. And so you talk about straight down to Jericho, that's exactly what it was like. But they carved that road out of stone. They carved that road in a place where there are all kinds of canyons and caves along the way. They carved that road in a place that if you move outside of it, it's almost totally desolate desert. And so it became a place where bandits and robbers lived, just like in Jesus' story. It became a place that was so dangerous that in one of the earliest travelers' warnings, which we have plenty of today, of course, that the Roman government warned any travelers, don't get on that Jericho road. It was so dangerous that Romans had built sentry posts all along that road to not much avail, to tell you the truth. The only people that could safely travel that road were priests and Levites, because nobody messed around with religious people. They probably didn't have any money, but they didn't mess around with the religious people. And prophetic types like Jesus that intimidated people by the power of their presence, and people that were Essene healers that were kind of like the Red Cross of their day and time, didn't have enough doctors, so you didn't want to kill any of them. And so Jesus moves along that road many, many times and was probably familiar with its stories. So one thing we can just about know for sure. When the guy who ends up in the ditch, nearly dead, makes his way down that road, it was likely out of desperation, and it was likely a mechanism of escape. That was his escape route for reasons that we don't really understand. That would have been the only reason to be on that road by yourself. Guy was in a ditch. He was nearly dead. The guy was in a ditch, probably because he was running from some scandal or something he had done, and that was the only choice he had of getting away quickly. Now, with that background, let's look at the story. The Bible says that a priest and Levite come along, and the priest and Levite see the man in the ditch, and the priest and the Levite walk by on the other side. Now, in the traditional way that we've looked at that parable, in the common way that we've looked at that parable, that becomes a proof text for us of how much better Christians are than Jews. And that parable's been used for that lots and lots. By the time that you come to Europe in the 30s and 40s, it was a popular parable to talk about in order to reinforce the point that Jews were pretty worthless. I can't imagine we would think that Jesus would have seen the parable in that way, but that's the way it's been used over history. I don't think we can assume that that priest and Levi were bad people. I don't think we can assume that they were in such a hurry to get to church or some other appointment that they gave that priority over a man's life. I think that it's more likely that that priest and Levite looked at that man in the ditch, knew the circumstances of that escape route stretch of road, and figured the guy deserved it. He was so stupid in his decision making that he'd go out on this road by himself. He deserves it. He must have done something really wrong, and finally the people he wronged caught up with him and got their just dues. He deserved it. And they walked by on the other side. I think that's got greater accuracy attached to it than to say that they were just mean old Jews that didn't want to help somebody. That becomes bigotry and racist. That would not have been Jesus. And then the Samaritan becomes the hero of the story. And the way that we've traditionally talked about this parable, we've rightly understood that these Samaritans were distant cousins of the people Jesus was talking to, and they were despised. We know that these Samaritans would have always been pushed to the outside by the circumstances of life in Jerusalem and would have been looked down upon. And so we've always surmised that in his attempt to really get these people, Jesus was asserting to a place of heroism and character, a Samaritan, for heaven's sake. Well, I think that's partly right. I think Jesus was always telling stories that had an element in them that was bound to get people's attention. And the minute he throws that Samaritan in there, he had everybody's attention. But in the way that Jesus taught, Jesus had a tendency to do something that would capture attention, and then after he captured attention, to attach to that what it was he was trying to tell people. And so, yes, the Samaritan in the story captures attention almost like a literary device. But what we have to do is to look and see what Jesus attached to that. And so I think it was much more than a story about a Samaritan who acts in a heroic way, and the traditional Jews wouldn't have liked the Samaritans to be the hero of a story. And so what was Jesus trying to bring to our attention? I believe it was more than just helping somebody in trouble. I believe it was more than that. Because if that's all the parable is, then it's pretty ho-hum. Because who wouldn't say, help somebody in trouble? Who wouldn't say, be a decent person? Who wouldn't say, if you see somebody that has a need, try to relate to it? There's a million stories from lots of people, even beyond religious teachers, who said, help somebody in trouble. So there's got to be more to the parable than that. And so here's what I think. I think that Jesus was saying that that Samaritan came down that road and saw that man in the ditch and set aside the whole idea of deserve. Maybe the man did deserve it. Maybe the priest and the Levite were totally right about that. Maybe the man did deserve it, and he just got what was coming in, just like Saddam's soldiers, just like Hitler's soldiers, just like maybe Zedekiah. But that Samaritan may have done something that was radical for his world and for ours. He may have just put on the table the whole idea of what someone deserves or what someone doesn't deserve. And maybe when he did that, that became the opening for compassion and the opening for sympathy, and in his case, empathy, that allowed him to help the guy. Maybe the Samaritan set aside deserve. When we let the idea of what we deserve or what someone else deserves get up in the middle of our lives, then before you know it, it becomes very egotistically what I deserve, what I ought to have, what ought to come my way. If we let the idea of deserve take over, then we're all the time making these comparative relationships with us and other people, especially if those other people may have something more than we do and we don't think they deserve it. If we let the idea of deserve get into a relationship, then suddenly that relationship is built on some kind of a quid pro quo. I've done this for you, now you do this for me. And any competent marriage counselor or any competent psychologist will tell you that once a relationship becomes quid pro quo, what I've done for you, now what you need to do for me, then that relationship is on very, very, very weak footing. Those soldiers in the Gulf War looked on those Iraqis and they took deserve off the table. And they opened up compassion and empathy and sympathy for the enemy. Those soldiers in the Blaze Gap took deserve off the table. And they served tea to those German soldiers. And that Good Samaritan walking along that escape route, not knowing if the man in the ditch was some kind of trick or not knowing what the man in the ditch had done to get there, takes deserve off the table and becomes the basis then for one of the most profound stories that Jesus ever tells. I believe that that story is true for us today. I don't think it's easy, and I don't think it's common. I think sometimes it's very, very hard. But if we could quit worrying about what we deserve, or if we could quit obsessing about what we deserve compared to somebody else, or if we quid pro quos, you do this, I'll do that, deals out of our relationships. If we took deserve off the table, then there might be a clarity of Christ-likeness that we would have to look at other people that would open the door for the kind of compassion and care that we see that good Samaritan providing. Let's keep in mind that this guy who tells the parable is the same one who said, love your enemies. Is the same one who said, be good to those that despitefully use you. Maybe the beginning point of love, or the beginning point of goodness, is taking deserve off the table. How many times has our language been punctuated by, I don't deserve that. He doesn't deserve that. She doesn't deserve that. We don't deserve that. How many times has our language been punctuated by, I deserve better than that. We deserve better than that. And when we put deserve into the equation, we kind of push love and goodness off to the side and close that portal that would allow us to be of greatest help and greatest service. What would it take if we prayed to God to help us take the whole idea of deserve off the table of our lives? Let's pray. Help us, Father, when our egos and our self-reference become so strong that we become obsessed with what we deserve in relation to other people around us, what we deserve in relationship to people in our families, what we deserve in our relationships, even with significant others. Help us that we might somehow look beyond that distinction. And in doing so, open the door for the kind of love and the kind of goodness that you call us to. Help us that we might go back and reconsider this parable and know that Jesus wanted it to have force and power that would stand across the ages. And if all that it's about is just helping somebody, as valid as that concern is, that's not very forceful. If all that it's about is some Samaritan that came in and helped and surprised everybody, that's not forceful enough. Help us to know that Jesus must have had something else in mind that would have powerful force and implication for life that would continue. And maybe it is this. Maybe it's the idea of deserve. And our not looking at ourselves and our not looking at others in terms of what we think we deserve or they deserve. Help us that we might table the whole idea of deserve and find our Christianity and our Christ-likeness easier to assume in our lives. For we ask our prayer in Jesus' name, praying that in your judgment of us, you would not be concerned with deserve. Amen. Thank y'all for coming today. Hope you'll have a good week. Hope y'all come back.